Now let's dive back in and talk about arranging tables. That is using visual encoding, especially spatial position, to look at tabular data. So we're going to think about the hows specifically on the visual encoding side, and this idea that we are arranging information spatially because spatial position is such an important way to understand data, and it is so perceptually crucial. So we're going to focus first on these questions of arranging things in space. We're starting with tabular data, and many of the things with tabular data will also transfer to spatial and network data, which we will then talk about in turn. But we'll get through a lot of the basic concepts with the tabular data type. So when we're thinking about arranging tables, we're going to think about expressing quantitative values, separating, ordering, and aligning spatial regions, thinking about the number of keys versus values that there are in a data set, the orientation of the axes, things about whether the layout is dense or space filling. So let's walk through these. First, let's start out with this idea of keys and values. What do I mean by that? So a key, that's sort of a word out of databases. If you were in the statistics, you might be calling this an independent variable, or I'll call it an independent attribute. We're using it as a way to look things up. It's got to be a unique index. And in simple tables, you just have one key, right? If you have a table of student information, you might have student ID as your unique identifier. It gets more complicated with multidimensional tables where you might need multiple keys. If you think about 2 or 3 dimensional arrays as a programmer, that's an example of where to look up. You need not just a single key, but multiple. An example we could think in that example of perception versus cognition I showed in the very first snippet, what we saw was that we had genes and we also had time points. And we were doing a bunch of experiments for this gene at this time point. So you had to, in order to get a value, you would have to look up both the gene and the time point, and the combination of those would index a unique value that you could then get. So we're thinking of values as what you might call a dependent variable or attribute, a value that you could look up. Now, the reason we're getting into this is that it's really instructive to think about visual encodings according to how many keys there are in that data. And of course, this is always, again, coming down to semantics. Deciding what's a key and what's a value can be a judgment call. But we're going to walk through either 0 keys or 1 or 2 in this tutorial. So let's start with 0 keys. And that's the case of a scatter plot. So a scatter plot has quantitative attributes on both of the axes. So you really are simply expressing quantitative value. You don't have a key-based lookup. So we're going to walk through a lot of these idioms and analyze them systematically. So our data is 2 quantitative attributes. Our mark type is points. Our visual channels are horizontal and vertical spatial position. Now, let's think about what tasks these visual encodings are good for. Well, they help you find trends. They help you find outliers, like many other visualizations. But you can look at distributions of each dimension independently. They're very good for finding correlation. If things are tightly along the diagonal, they're correlated. They're also good for finding clusters. For scalability, hundreds of items could be seen. And for scalability, we're always going to think of having a canonical size of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. So if you had the entire screen, what kind of scalability would you get? So for scatter plots, let's say certainly hundreds of items would be possible with a display of that size. Now, what if there are keys? And how do we think about this when we have categorical data? Because what we want to think about is regions. I'm just going to say a region is like, you know, a spot, an area, a contiguous bounded area where different regions are distinct from each other. And remember how I said that proximity was a really strong cue. So things that are together within a region are going to be perceived as being grouped together or similar or related in some way. So regions allow us to divide space up. And we know that for categorical attributes, it's very legitimate to say you're in a region or you're not in a region based on your categorical level. However, What's a little tricky is we did just talk about the idea that ordering is something we do with quantitative or ordered attributes. And so if we've divided up into regions according to a categorical attribute, well, somehow we might actually order them in space. We could even align them to get that highest precision, perceptual ability to look at lengths, because aligned lengths are our very most accurate thing that we can do. So if we've separated by a categorical variable, then we could use an ordered attribute to give us both order and alignment for regions, if we so chose. So let's look at a bar chart now that we've got this idea of separating order and aligning. A bar chart we can think of as having one key. In this case, it's across the horizontal axis. I've got my animal type chart. And then one quantitative attribute, which I've got on my vertical axis, of the average weight of that type of animal. Got a line mark type, clearly. And I'm using length to express this quantitative value. And well, what are we exactly doing? We're dividing these up into spatial regions. There's one region per mark, and they're separated horizontally, and they are aligned vertically, so we can make those nice, high precision, accurate judgments. And well, how do we order them? And the answer is, it depends, and we can choose. We have to somehow order them to display them on the page. Sometimes that order might be a little arbitrary, like alphabetically. That's what we've done in the chart on the left. And sometimes we could actually have a data-driven ordering, which tends to be a lot more informative, where we use the same attribute that we use to length code to actually order the animal types. So in this case, we actually might be able to see some patterns there. What task are bar charts good for? Well, they're very good for comparing. They're very good for doing a direct lookup of values. And let's think about the scalability of bar charts. Well, for the number of key attributes, we could at least, if we had 1,000 pixels wide, we could at least fit dozens, maybe even hundreds of these key attributes. We could also think, what about scalability in the other direction? How many levels of the quantitative attribute could we actually distinguish? And the answer is, almost 1,000, many, many hundreds. We could actually start seeing 1 pixel variations, especially if bars were right next to each other. We have very, very high accuracy for making length judgments along an aligned axis. So that part we're getting very good precision on. So now let's think of a slightly different kind of a bar chart, a stacked bar chart. What we've done here is we've added one more key. There's a second categorical attribute that we're encoding. And we're also doing something a little more complicated. We don't just have a line anymore. We've got all these line segments that are stacked up on top of each other. So I'm going to call this a glyph, a composite object where we have some internal structure because there's more than one mark. Because if we think of each mark as representing one item, we've got more things going on here. So we've got this vertical stack of line marks. So the channels we're still using length, we're using color. And we've got these spatial regions where, again, we've divided up. But now in each region, we don't just have a single line, we have this whole glyph, which is the stacked bar. A thing to notice is that we have high precision ability to compare lengths for the bottom segment of the stacked bar chart and for the entire bar. But we don't have high precision length for those intermediate segments, like the red segments, the orange segments. It's harder to tell if they're exactly the same height or not because they are not aligned on a common scale. They're actually unaligned. So it's still a spatial position judgment, but unaligned length is harder to understand than aligned length. So we are less accurate with those. This is actually showing some data from computer systems. The domain isn't so important for this example. The task that stacked bars are particularly good for are part to whole relationships, in addition to everything that a standard bar chart does. And a key point about scalability here is, although we could still do hundreds of key attributes along the horizontal axis, we absolutely could not do hundreds of segments along the vertical axis. That just would not work perceptually. So we're limited to maybe a dozen levels for the stacked attribute as opposed to the attribute we're using on the horizontal axis. And this is a key asymmetry that although they're both categorical attributes, we can handle far more levels on the one we're spreading horizontally than on the one we're stacking. That's the kind of asymmetry and differences that we're really trying to uncover with this sort of systematic discussion and analysis. So to continue with this theme, what other more exotic things can we do? If you generalize the concept of a stacked graph, you get this interesting thing called a stream graph, much less well-known, a little more exotic. And the idea is, instead of having a bunch of stacked bars, you're actually trying to emphasize horizontal continuity. So what this particular graph is showing is that there's a categorical key attribute, which is a musical artist. There's an ordered key attribute, which is time points. So time is going horizontally. And then you've got a quantitative value attribute, which is the counts, in this case of how often their songs were listened to. And what happens is we take that base data and we derive geometry. So this is an example of deriving data, transforming data. There's this new, fairly complex algorithm, you can check the paper out if you're curious, for coming up with these layers of how tall each of these layers is, representing one artist. And you also come up with an ordering of how to order the layers vertically. Again, trying to preserve some continuity. Now the scalability is interesting. We can still have hundreds of time points horizontally, but we can get away with a lot more artist keys because of the specific phenomenon that these artists don't necessarily extend throughout all the time points. There's a burst where there's a lot of activity, which is what's being tracked here. So we can handle many more of these categorical levels in the stream graph than we could in the stacked bars, because of the characteristics of the data, that they don't extend across the whole thing. And so we're able to use only a part of the horizontal axis to show that. Let's look at another idiom, which might sound straightforward, and I'm sure you've all seen line charts. It's actually slightly tricky to reason about in this sort of systematic analysis. So let's dig in. So in a line chart, there's one key and one value. In this case, our example, we've got a key of year data, and we've got a value of how much my cat weighed in a particular year. As you can see, there were issues. So what is the mark type here? Conceptually, we have point marks that are actually marking where for a year, what the weight of the cat was. So those are points, and we are connecting those points with line segments. So the line segment is not itself showing the data the way it did with a bar chart. The line segment is connecting the points. In fact, in many line charts, we don't even necessarily draw those point marks. We just see the connecting line segments, which is part of why it's a little tricky to analyze. So what's going on here? The length, the aligned height of those dots is expressing the quantitative value. We're doing the same thing as with the bar chart, where we're separating and ordering by some attribute. In this case, the attribute is actually ordered itself, which is these years. So we didn't have to wonder about the horizontal ordering. But the key thing is that we're really emphasizing trends here, because the connection marks are emphasizing the relationship between one data point and the next, between 2004 and 2005. It's emphasizing that connection by having a connecting mark to do that. So this very strongly implies trends. That's great if what you're looking for is trends. It's great if the data that you've got is correct for this. A caution is to be careful. This is such a strong effect that it can actually sometimes outweigh reason. So there's a lovely study by Zaks and Tversky on bars versus lines, where the fundamental rule is, if it's categorical data, you typically want to go with the bar chart, and if it's ordered data, then it's okay to have a line chart. But don't use a line chart if your key attribute is categorical, because people will start thinking trends where that doesn't even make sense. Literally, people in the study would say things like, not just the older you are, the taller you are, but the more male you are, the taller you are. This makes no sense. That's not how the world works. But the point is that visual cue to think about trends is so strong. So that's an example of the kind of thing where you have to be careful that your visual encoding is appropriate for your attribute types. This is one reason we're emphasizing so much attribute types and channel capacities. Okay, we've talked a little bit about one key. Let's now move on to what happens when you have two keys in a matrix layout. So here's an example of a heat map. What have we got here? We're basically encoding information through color saturation. So here we've got two keys and one value. In this case, going back to that running example of you've got a gene and an experimental condition, and those are two categorical attributes. And then you've got this quantitative attribute of basically how much the gene was doing its gene job. It's called gene expression. And we're trying to show that in a little box. What we've done is we have separated not just along an axis, but all along two axes. So we're aligning in a two-dimensional matrix that's indexed by these two categorical attributes. You really can think of this like, you know, literally a matrix that you're seeing. And we are coloring by this quantitative attribute. We'll talk more about color maps in a later segment. This one is an ordered diverging one. The task is to find clusters, particularly if you reorder the rows and columns computationally to try to detect clusters to make them visually apparent. This is also very, very good for finding outliers. We can definitely spot outliers when they're bright against a dark background. Now let's think about the scalability. If we had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, in the limit, we could have each of these cells be a single pixel, and we could have up to 1,000 of these categorical levels. That would let us actually have 1 million items. This is a very information-dense, compact way of showing information. But there's an important thing you should consider. How many of the quantitative attribute levels can we actually show? Not that many. We certainly cannot see hundreds of different shades of bright green and bright red here. Maybe we can see about 5 of each, so there'd be about a total of 10 attribute levels that we're able to encode in this way. So while we can see many, many items, that's high precision, we can only see quite low precision information about that quantitative attribute. So again, we're thinking about what's possible with scale and what are the trade-offs. So far, we've been talking about rectilinear axis orientations of, you know, an axis and then that second axis. But we could do other things. We could have axes parallel to each other. We could have axes radially. Let's talk a little bit about that as well. So we've talked about scatter plots. Now let's talk about scatter plot matrix or SPLOM. So in a scatter plot matrix, as the name suggests, we have a bunch of scatter plots. We, in fact, if we have k attributes, we actually have all pairwise combinations of 2 of those k attributes. So all the possible pairs we show, and then we can actually look not just at 2 attributes at once, but at the entire set of attributes. Now, if we think about the scalability here, let's say if we have, you know, a dozen attributes, well, then of course we've got a dozen squared, you know, in terms of the number of things we might be able to see at once. So if we have a computer screen of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, maybe for each of those, you know, plots, we might be able to see from dozens to hundreds of items, depending on how many attributes we have. But clearly, we're not going to be able to see thousands of items or thousands of attributes. It's just this won't scale. There's not enough room in the individual little scatter plots to actually see the dots. So we've got some limits on what we can do with SPLOMs. They're powerful, but scalability limits. A different approach is what's called parallel coordinates. So let's actually look at the same data set. This is a table of marks, math, physics, dance, and drama for 5 different people. In the parallel coordinate view, what we do is we have an axis and then we have another axis and another axis. The axes are in parallel to each other. And we go along the axis and we find the point and we go from one axis to another. So instead of representing an item as a bunch of points in the different scatterplot matrices, an item is a single jagged line along these parallel coordinate axes. So it's a different way of seeing points. Let's think about scale. The key thing is, instead of just having a horizontal axis and a vertical axis and then running out of axes, we can have many axes. We can have maybe dozens of axes. And we can maybe get away with hundreds of items. So a key question, though, is we're able to make high precision comparisons between neighboring pairs of axes, but much harder to make comparisons between pairs of axes that are further away from each other. So a crucial question with parallel coordinates is how to come up with the axis ordering. That's one of the major challenges of this approach. So for tasks like correlation, you're probably familiar with seeing that in scatter plots. It's along diagonal, either positive one way, negative the other way. And if they're all spread out, then it's uncorrelated. With parallel coordinates, it's a bit different. Positive correlation looks very different from negative correlation. Positive correlation is parallel line segments like we see on the top. And negative correlation, like we see on the bottom, is they all actually meet in the middle as lines go from one to the other, and they meet at this pencil point. Uncorrelated means the crossings are just scattered. So it is possible to see correlation in parallel coordinates. Typically, people have to be taught if they haven't seen them before. Although technically that is true of scatter plots as well. They're just more common, so more people have been taught that. Let's now think a little bit about radial axes. What's going on with that? I'm sure you've all seen pie charts. Analyzing them, what we've got is, well, it's not a point mark, clearly. We could think, are they area marks? Are they line marks? What's actually going on here? You know, they definitely have variable area. There's definitely an angle going on with the pie chart. There's been a fair amount of discussion about whether what we're actually perceiving is the area or the angle or maybe the arc length of the arc on the outside of the circle. But whichever one of those three it is, those are all less accurately perceived than line length, which is what we see in the analog, which is a bar chart. So pie chart is actually only one of two variants. If you thought about, well, I want to make a bar chart and be radial, one thing you could do is you could say, I'm going to have the angle correspond to the quantitative attribute. And the other thing you could say is I'm going to have the length correspond. And that's what we call a polar area chart or a coxcomb chart or a nightingale chart. It's a more direct analog with the bar charts. But the key thing to notice is that these are both not as easy to perceive as a bar chart. They both do have, structurally, you can see the underlying similarity. There's a categorical key attribute and there's a quantitative value attribute, and you're either using a rectilinear axis or you're using a radial axis, where there's one that you go out on the radius and then there's one where you're going and sweeping around to the angle. And these are good for the task of part to whole judgments. Now, if we're thinking about information density, now how much information can we fit in a relatively small number of pixels, then we can consider an alternative, the normalized stacked bar charts. So take the stacked bar charts we've already seen and for each bar normalize it so it's taking up the entire height, and that's what we see on the top there. We've normalized the bar chart in the middle. And then we're also able to do part to whole comparisons. The thing to note is that one of those normalized stacked bars is equivalent to an entire pie chart. So you're able to fit a lot more information in a small region of the screen. So you have a higher information density than something like a pie chart. Now, I've talked about some of those radial charts as being less accurately perceived. So what are the advantages of radial layouts? Here's an example of glyphmaps, which is approached from Hadley, Wickham, and others. And what we see, interestingly, is on top, we've got the same data, rectilinear on top and radial on the bottom. And with the rectilinear plots, it's incredibly obvious when you've got linear versus curved, right? We can really have that jump out at us in a way that's much harder to see in the radial plots on the bottom. But conversely, we just sort of see squiggles in the rectilinear ones for trying to understand this cyclic pattern. And on the radial ones at the bottom, we can actually see whether the cyclic wraparound is just before or just after or almost spot on. So cyclic patterns are what radial charts are very good at uncovering. So if you do suspect some kind of cyclicity and you're checking for that, that can really be where radial charts shine. So to sum up some of our discussion of orientation, in terms of rectilinear, 2 axes is great. 3 can be problematic. We'll talk more about that. And 4 or more is simply impossible unless you do something exotic. With parallel coordinates, there's the unfamiliarity problem, so there can be training time requirements. And with radial axes, there's this perceptual limitation, which can sometimes be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's what you want, sometimes it's not what you want, that we have lower precision with these angular things than with the lengths. Sometimes you have a data set where, in fact, you want to have one higher precision and one lower precision one. That could, again, be a really good fit for radial. There's a nice paper by Deal et al. Talking about the strengths and weaknesses of radial visualizations. All right, so for this snippet, there's also quite a bit of further reading if people are curious, especially the brief history of data milestones is a very easy to browse one. And we'll wrap up this segment for now and think of questions.